but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first.
One of the most comforting illusions Hollywood ever offered us was the belief that kindness could survive anything. For many Americans who grew up watching television in the golden age of family entertainment, Ron Howard was not just a familiar face. He was a symbol of gentleness in an industry built on ego, noise, and constant reinvention. And as the years passed, that image only deepened. The red-haired boy from a small fictional town became the calmest, most respected director of his generation. The man who could guide chaos into beauty without ever raising his voice. But time changes all things, and even the softest hearts carry scars. Behind the warm smile and steady leadership lies a lifetime of battles most viewers never saw. They were not fights with studios or critics. They were the quiet, the private conflicts with the very people he worked to elevate. Performers whose tempers, egos, or unpredictability tested his patience in ways no script could prepare him for. And that is the truth we explore today. Not to diminish legends, but to understand the hidden cost of grace. Because when a man as kind as Ron Howard reaches his limit, the story behind it is never simple and always worth hearing. So stay with me as we step behind the curtain, back to the moments that shaped him, challenged him, and ultimately defined the director millions still admire. Andy Griffith stands at the beginning of Ron Howard's story, not because he was the most difficult man Howard ever worked with, but because he was the first person to teach him that the warmth audiences see on television does not always survive once the cameras stop. This chapter of Ron's life feels especially poignant. It is the moment where innocence met reality, where a child actor learned that even the people we admire most can carry shadows that never appear on screen. When Ron Howard first walked onto the set of The Andy Griffith Show, he was only 6 years old, small, soft-spoken, and still trying to understand the world around him. The man who greeted him was everything America adored, gentle, smiling, patient. To millions, Andy Griffith represented a version of American decency that felt timeless and trustworthy. And for young Ron, working beside him did not feel like acting. It felt like belonging. For years, Ron spoke lovingly of how Andy made him feel valued. He was not treated like a prop or a child who needed to be positioned in front of the lens. He was spoken to as a partner, encouraged to contribute, reminded that he mattered. There are few gifts more powerful to a child than the feeling of being truly seen. In the early days, Griffith offered that freely. Those moments were real. But sets are living things. They change as people change. As the seasons passed, the pressure on Griffith grew heavier. A show beloved by an entire nation demanded precision, constant reinvention, and the impossible task of staying perfect year after year. That pressure showed. People who worked closely with him later described a slow but steady shift. Andy became more guarded, more irritable, quicker to snap when things were not just right. And Ron, still young and still learning, found himself quietly navigating this new side of the man he had once seen as endlessly gentle. He learned to read the room, how to stay out of the way when tension filled the air, to measure his words carefully. These are lessons no child should have to learn so early. Yet they shaped Howard into the calm, steady collaborator he would one day become. The real turning point came during the show's final seasons. Ron was no longer a little boy. He was a teenager beginning to understand storytelling, character motivation, and the craft behind the scripts. Naturally, he asked questions, smart ones, thoughtful ones. But Griffith did not always welcome them. The more Ron tried to understand his role, the more he sensed Andy pulling back, guarding the authority he felt slipping away. What had once been mentorship now felt like walking on fragile glass. Their relationship never erupted into a public confrontation. There were no scandals, no dramatic fallouts. Instead, there was distance. Quiet, steady, and unspoken. After the show ended, the two rarely worked together again. Their interactions became polite, brief, almost formal. Yet what makes this chapter powerful is not the tension. It is the lesson Ron carried with him. He learned that kindness on screen should not be an act. It should be a standard. It should be real. As a director, he built sets where no child, no performer, no crew member would ever feel the unease he felt in those final seasons. And as we step from Ron's childhood into his adult career, that lesson becomes even more vital. Stepping out of those early shadows and into adulthood, Ron Howard carried with him a quiet conviction. A set should feel safe, steady, and grounded. Everything a young actor like he once was had desperately needed. And for many years, Howard succeeded in building exactly that kind of environment. But nothing in his early career could fully prepare him for the storm he faced when working with Tom Sizemore, a performer of extraordinary talent whose volatility was as legendary as his screen presence. The project was Ransom in 1996, a high-stakes thriller built on intensity, precision, and emotional control. For Howard, it was the kind of film that demanded discipline from everyone, from the star at the top of the call sheet to the newest production assistant. The studio had every confidence in Howard's steady leadership. On paper, the ground was solid. But in reality, the set would soon feel like a tightrope stretched over an unpredictable abyss. Sizemore was cast as one of the film's antagonists, a role he was by many accounts born to play. His talent was undeniable, raw, fierce, and magnetic. When he was focused, his performances were unmatched. But industry insiders also knew that his personal struggles often bled into his work, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty around him. For a director like Howard, who cherished order, stability, and mutual respect, that uncertainty was the first crack in the foundation. Reports from the production describe a pattern that quickly became impossible to ignore. Sizemore arrived late. He sometimes appeared disoriented, unfocused, or overwhelmed. Scenes that should have moved with tight efficiency dragged on as Howard recalibrated around the turbulence one person brought with him. Retakes multiplied not because Sizemore lacked talent, but because his energy shifted wildly from moment to moment, throwing off both rhythm and chemistry. And here is where Howard's nature became both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. He never shouted. He never humiliated anyone. He never lashed out. Instead, he tried to absorb the chaos, redirect it, and shield the rest of the cast from its impact. Crew members would later recall seeing him quietly reorganize entire days of shooting around Sizemore's unpredictability. It was leadership through compassion. But compassion has limits even for a man like Howard. The breaking point came during a key sequence, one that required emotional precision and physical control. Sizemore's behavior during the setup became so erratic that continuing production risked the safety and emotional cohesion of the entire scene. Howard made a rare and difficult decision. He shut the scene down, not in anger, not in frustration, but in a quiet, steady voice that signaled he had reached a boundary he rarely expressed out loud. For those watching, the moment was sobering. The kindest man in Hollywood had been pushed to act not out of irritation, but out of necessity. In the years that followed, Howard never criticized Sizemore publicly. He never recounted harsh details or used the experience as a cautionary tale. That restraint speaks to the character shaped during his early years, the desire to protect the dignity of others even when circumstances were painful. But the silence also speaks to something deeper. Not every wound needs to be revisited, and not every professional encounter deserves a second chapter. What remains from that turbulent collaboration is not bitterness, but another defining lesson in Howard's life. That kindness can coexist with boundaries, thus and that even the most patient leaders must sometimes reclaim control to protect the people depending on them. Coming out of that turbulence, Ron Howard found himself confronting a different kind of challenge, one that was not chaotic or explosive, but deeply rooted in creative friction. If Sizemore was a storm, Shelley Long was a wall, solid, immovable, and determined to stand exactly where she believed she should. And in many ways, this test arrived at the most vulnerable moment of Howard's early directing career, when he was still learning how to balance authority with collaboration. The year was 1982, and Night Shift was more than just a studio comedy. For Howard, it was a proven ground. This film marked his first major step into Hollywood's big leagues. Add to that a cast with wildly different artistic instincts, and the stakes rose even higher. Henry Winkler provided the calm and stability Howard needed. Michael Keaton, on the verge of becoming a breakout star, brought a whirlwind of creativity, improvising and exploring, throwing out new ideas like sparks from a fire. Then came Shelley Long, bringing a level of structure and rigidity that clashed instantly with the looseness of the set Howard hoped to cultivate. It was not that Long lacked talent. In fact, she was brilliant, sharp, and thoughtful, with a comedic precision that would later make her a television phenomenon. But she approached every scene like an architect approaches a blueprint. Every line had a place, every gesture a purpose, every beat a calculation. She wanted certainty, clarity, and control. When those expectations collided with the unpredictable experimental style that Keaton thrived on, tension surfaced almost immediately. Crew members would later recall how scenes often stalled because Long wanted to understand every shift in tone, every word choice, every camera movement. She would question blocking, challenge rewrites, and debate comedic timing with the intensity of someone who believed that perfection lay only in absolute precision. For a seasoned director, navigating that would have been challenging. For young Ron Howard still finding his footing, it was exhausting. Yet, what makes this chapter compelling is not the conflict itself, but the way Howard responded to it. He refused to meet tension with tension. Instead, he listened. He negotiated. He tried to weave together her structure with Keaton's improvisational spark, even when it meant bending the entire schedule around Long's demands. But beneath that calm exterior, the strain was real. Howard would later admit in careful, diplomatic language that some performers arrive on set with their minds so made up that there is no space left for discovery. And discovery is often where the true magic of filmmaking happens. The breaking point during Night Shift came when Long reportedly halted production for hours, insisting that a pivotal scene needed to be completely rewritten. Not adjusted, rewritten. For a first-time major director trying to prove himself, this was not a minor delay. It was a question of authority, a test of whether Howard could maintain control while still protecting the collaborative spirit he valued so deeply. Howard never raised his voice.